Okay, so if you weren't here last week, you have your notebook. We're going to review briefly some of the things. Last week everybody got a little bent out of shape because it couldn't keep up with the fill in the blanks. So turn to page. Well, let me look at the letter on the first page. The only thing I wanted to reiterate again about that first page is that last paragraph, that this notebook is for this Bible study. And I didn't mean that in a way, I don't want you sharing my stuff. No, that's not the point. I don't want the Bible study put out there because I haven't cited all my references. I haven't said, I got this map from this book or this quote from this book. So it's not to protect my material, it's protect things I took from those books that I listed up above. So that's the reason for that. Okay, so let's turn and just very briefly make sure we have all our blanks filled in. Here you go. Very quickly, there are two major divisions. If you're new, try to write these down. If not, you can copy from your neighbor later. Old Testament and New Testament. There are 39 books in the Old Testament. There are 27 books in the New Testament and 66 books in the entire Bible. 3 kinds of books in the Old Testament: historical, poetical, and prophetical. Everybody got that? 17 of those books are historical. 5 are poetical, 17 are prophetical. And then we learned that there are 11 primary historical books and 6 secondary historical books. Okay, all right, so now move to the next page. Page 3. There are 27 books in the New Testament. There are 3 types: historical, Pauline epistles, meaning they're letters written by Paul, and general epistles. The first 5 are historical. Those are the Gospel and Acts. The next 13 are Pauline epistles. The next 9 are general epistles. It's written in 3 languages: Greek, Hebrew, and I learned today 1% of Aramaic. There are approximately 40 different human authors. God is the main author of the Bible. God breathed his words into 40 different human authors, and it was written over a period of 1,600 years, from Moses in 1500 BC. I got that confused last week. I said AD. Y'all called me out very loudly. So thankful for that. 1600 BC, from Moses to Revelation 100 AD. All right, so if you're new, you got that filled in. What's on the next slide? Okay, we're not going there yet. Okay, so page 4, the list of all the Old Testament books in their category. Okay, this timeline, let's look at it one more time. I think this is one of the best I looked everywhere for a good timeline to show how these books fit into history. Remember, this is Old Testament history. The 11, under the historical books, the second row of books, those are the 11 primary historical books. So if you want to read all the history of the Hebrew, of the Jewish people, you read Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Now, the books on top of that, those are the secondary historical books. Those repeat or amplify everything in those 11 books. So if you're reading a story in 2 Samuel and then you read in 1 Chronicles and you realize, I already read that story. Well, it's repeating or amplifying from maybe a different perspective in those books. And then on top of that, this chart, you can refer to this chart throughout the entire Bible study. Any questions about this chart? Okay. And which reminds me, if you do have questions that you want answered, like about something, then you can write it on a 3x5 card. There should be some in your notebook. Unless you came today, there's not any in your notebook. But we have 3x5 cards back here, and you can write your question and put them in that basket. Someone did write me a question last week and said, where did God come from? I'm like, oh, great. Okay. All right. So we'll talk about that. Okay. So now turn to page 6. That just shows the list of your New Testament books. Okay, so if you were not here last week, you need to do this geography. You can't understand history without knowing the geography. So all you do is use the pages, page 7, fill in those blanks on page 8, the numbers from the Mediterranean Sea down to the Persian Gulf. Okay, so you've got your definite, if you weren't here, you need to do that. You need to sort of get a grasp of where things happened in Old Testament history. The map's on page 8. Oh, and I put some markers on your table because some people wanted to color in their water. So if you want to, so only had like enough for 2. There should be some highlighters. Actually, they're highlighters. Did you get any highlighters back there, Kathleen? You did get highlighters? Somebody can share with that table. I didn't put a highlighter on that table. So you can color in your water so you'll know what's water and what's land. Or you can bring your own markers or whatever. Okay, page 9 with the locations. This is all the locations that we're going to talk about in the Old Testament history. All your locations are listed there, A through G. The bodies of waters are numbers, and the land is letters. So then you go to page 10 and you fill in, like A is the Garden of Eden, and you can find that on your map. It's so important to know where this happened historically as we talk about it. And then page 11 just shows you a modern day map. You can look at that at your own leisure. And then page 12 shows us that, which is pretty fascinating, all of Old Testament history happened in an area that's smaller, actually, than the size of Texas. I've driven across Texas, and it's not small, but if I were walking across Texas, it would seem pretty large. But from Houston would be from Persia to Odessa, which would be Israel, that would be about the size of it. And then last night, or this weekend, I hope that you filled in your map on page 13. It's just having a good understanding. You can always refer back to your maps, but it's just having a good understanding of where things happen. You have to understand history, you have to know the geography. And again, I had terrible history teachers and geography teachers. In high school, I learned nothing except football plays. Okay. And one thing I neglected to say last week in the morning when we were talking about, Caitlin, do you have a notebook? Under the table. Oh, she's got one. Okay, great. All right. One thing I neglected to say last week when we kept talking about the Jewish people or the Hebrew people, and it's just like it gets confusing who is who. So how many names do one people group need? Well, they have a lot of names. So the descendants of Abraham are called Jews. They're called Hebrews. They're called Israelites. They're called the children of Israel. They're called the nation of Israel. All of that is the same people group. So I remember as a child hearing about the Hebrews, and then I would hear about the Jews, and then I would hear about the Israelites. It's all the descendants of Abraham. It's all just the same name, same person, different name. Make sense? Okay. All right, so if you're new, you might want to look over pages 14 through 17, through 18, through 19. There we go. And to brings us to where we are today. We're going to start. Our study is on. Last week, if you weren't here, we had everyone put together a 350-piece puzzle without having the box to know what it looked like. I think the biggest, somebody over here got 75 pieces, but I think they cheated, but yeah. I had a group in the night, they got like 2 pieces or 3 pieces. And so the point of that exercise is that sometimes we look at the Bible and we start studying the Bible without knowing what the big picture is. We don't know that the Jews and the Israelites and the Hebrews are all the same people. And we're listening at church to Matt or Patrick teach, and he's talking about this, and we don't know what he's talking about. Or we do a study, or we start reading in Jeremiah, and we don't know who he's talking to. Or we read Habakkuk, and we don't know, well, who is he talking to? Who is he prophesying for or to or against? And so you need to know the big picture, and that's what this study is. We're putting the border around the Bible, those flat edges, and we're going to fill in the center with some of the pieces. We won't know all the details of the Bible, but you're going to understand the big picture and how it's laid out. So there's 12 periods or eras, I call them periods, in the Bible. 9 of them are in the Old Testament, and 3 of them are in the New Testament. These names are not original with me. If you look at any commentaries or any books about the history of the Bible, you will find these eras written or talked about, these periods talked about. Just like in U.S. history, we have our periods of time like the Civil War. The main person was Abraham Lincoln, and it happened in Gettysburg. So we're going to look at the period of the name of the period. We're going to memorize those, and you're going to write it down several times. You probably hate me after you have to write it down so many times. Then you're going to have the person. Who's the main person in this historical timeline as we march through the Old Testament? Who is the person that goes with that period? And then where did it take place? And then a portrait, a little one-sentence description about that time. So if you just came today, you may be a little overwhelmed with all of that. You may have been overwhelmed with it when you were here last week. But if you're going to learn, and it's going to be more easy to understand as we march through it. Okay, so we're going to start today. We're going to try to get through 3 of the periods today. Let's turn back to page 14. And you will see all of the periods, the historical periods of the Old Testament listed right there. Let's read them together, just the name of the period, starting with creation, patriarch, Exodus, conquest, judges, kingdom, exile, return, and silence. So we're going to go through like lightning these 9 periods of the Old Testament, and we're going to start today with creation. I don't know what else is on my PowerPoint. Here we go. Here's what we're going to talk about. The period is creation. Who is the person? Adam. And where did it happen? Eden. And if you were here last week, you marked Eden on your map, so you know where it is, and you're going to mark it again in a minute. And the portrait is Adam is created by God, but he sins and brings sin into the world. So that covers the entire creation period. At the top of page 20, with that little pink thing that says creation period, write Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 11. That I neglected to put that, another mistake in my printing here. I forgot to put that in on this one. Genesis 1 through 11. So if you want to read more about the creation, read Genesis 1 through 11. Okay, so in each period, well, let's read it all together. Let's just say it in order. Creation, Adam, Eden. Adam is created by God, but he sins and brings sin into the world. Okay, under each period, we're going to look at 4 things in every single period of the Bible. And this one is 4 main events during the creation period. These are stories you've probably already heard. We're going to look at creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Outside, on the end of that sentence, I have the biblical reference. So if later in your homework, because you don't have any and you want some, you can read that a better account of that period. So this is probably one of the best known things of the Bible. If you are a Bible scholar, you know more about this. If you're a Bible novice, you've probably even heard the story of creation and the creation of Adam. All right, so we're going to probe a little bit deeper. We're going to look at the 4 main events during the creation period. And as I was looking at my time, I realized I've only got like 3 or 4 minutes to do all of this. So let's do it. So the first 2 chapters are, number 1, creation. God created man in his image. The first 2 chapters of the Bible, we see God's perfect creation, a vision of the world as it was meant to be. And these two chapters are a cornerstone of what we believe about mankind, because we were created by God. Where did God come from? God has always been. He wasn't created. He's not an old man with a white beard. He is spirit. He's eternal. There was never a time that God didn't exist. He is outside of time. So that's my definition of where God came from. So in the creation, God spoke, and the world came into existence. We're not gonna look into old earth, new earth. Was it 6 literal days or whatever? What we're going to believe and teach is that God created it. In the time frame, you can study that on your own. John 1:3 says, "Through him all things that were made were made. Without him nothing was made." God is the creator, whether he created us in the world in 7 days or over a period of time. And at the end of his creation of each day, what did he say? It is good. God was pleased with his work. He was pleased with creation. And then after he created man, he said, it is very good. So on the 6th day, he created Adam, and then he created Eve, so he wouldn't have to be alone. Adam wouldn't have to be alone. And he put them in this beautiful garden, paradise really, and provided for all of their needs. And then man and woman were made in God's image. What does that mean? It doesn't mean physical likeness. It means a personal and spiritual likeness. God made man and woman with intellect, emotion, and will. That's what separates us from the animals. It separates us in that, they are not made in God's likeness. Our dogs are made to sit in our lap and love us, and our cats, whatever you do with cat. I don't like cats, but we are different than animals because we are made in God's likeness. And God also made us with a moral sense of right and wrong. How do we know this? Because he said, have at it in this garden. It's beautiful, whatever you want, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that tells us that we were created with a moral sense of right and wrong because they knew this is right and this is wrong. Okay, so then we go to point 2, sin entered the world, the fall. That's in Genesis 3. If you want to dig deeper, go to Genesis 3. So Adam and Eve were living the good life, having a great time, the idyllic life, and then Satan, disguised as a talking snake, appeared to them and said, hey, you want to be like God? If you want to be, he didn't want you to eat this tree because he didn't want you to be like him. If you want to be like him, eat this fruit. And we know what happened. They ate the fruit. And from Satan, that we know it was Satan if you read in Revelation. But here's the deal about Satan. He's real. He has power. Here's the 2 things that are also true about him. He's not as powerful as God, and he's not eternal. So he convinced them to take a bite of whatever kind of fruit. If you want to think it's an apple, that's good. I don't know what it was. I guess we'll find out. And so when they did that, they disobeyed, sin entered that perfect world that God had created. Perfect world, idyllic world, and sin entered. So all the pain, all the suffering, all the sickness from mankind, from generation to generation, is because of that one act. Thank you very much. But the good news was, even then, God had a plan of redemption. We talked about last week that the Bible is a book about God and his plan to redeem us. God already had that plan of redemption. Jesus is already showing up through Adam. Adam is a type of Christ. It's when Christ is seen in people and events that serves as a type. It's a historical fact that illustrates a spiritual truth. So we see that through the entire Old Testament. We see the scarlet thread of Jesus being woven through all of this. So Adam is a type of Christ. How? Both he and Jesus entered the world through supernatural circumstances. Adam was created. Jesus came through a virgin birth. They were both sinless. Jesus remained that way. Adam did not. Adam and Eve were the only people born sinless. Adam is the head of the old creation, and Jesus Christ is the head of the new creation. So Adam and Eve, they ate the fruit, and suddenly they were ashamed. They knew they had done wrong, and they realized they had no clothes on, naked, as we say in Alabama. They were naked. And so they tried to cover themselves with leaves and fig leaves. And God said, no, that won't do. I mean, that's what we do. We try to cover our sin with justification, try to justify our sin or blame our sin or ignore our sin or do things like that to cover our sin. And so when Adam and Eve covered themselves, God said, hey, that's not going to do. Cover for sin can't be made by human hands. You can't cover sin with anything that's made with human hands. So God clothed them with animal skins. But in that clothing, he had to sacrifice an animal. Blood was shed in order for Adam and Eve to be covered from their shame and their sin. So that's really the first sacrifice. Sacrifice the animal, covered Adam and Eve with animal skin. And that also is a type that shows us an illustration of how Jesus, we can't cover our own sin. It can only be covered by Jesus' shed blood for us. All right, number 3, the flood, the judgment on man. You can read more about that in Genesis 6:10. This is probably one of the most well-known Bible stories. Who built the ark? Noah. No, we all know the songs about it, if you grew up in Sunday school. So the next 10 generations happened. People multiply. And so did man's tendency to rebel against God. Man became increasingly wicked, but he found one good family, Noah and his wife, his sons and their wives, and his wife. So there were 8 people. God told him to build this ark. He built it to his specifications. God said it's going to rain. It rained. No one survived except Noah and his family. And so the ark is also where we see Jesus. It's a type of Christ, because only those saved on the ark, just like Jesus is the one who saves us. The ark saved those from death, and Jesus saves us from death. So at the end of the flood, God said, okay, be fruitful and multiply and cover the earth. And so that leads us to the Tower of Babel. Number 4, the beginning of the nations. That's in Genesis 11. All right, so we find ourselves at a really, really low point in the Bible. God had told them to spread out, go inhabit the earth, and they didn't do it. Instead, they built this tower. Let's build a city to honor us and how great we are. Let's build a tower that reaches to the heavens and make a name for ourselves. And God said, no, I told you to disperse. So he caused them to speak in different languages, and they had to disperse out according to the language that they were speaking. And that's the beginning of the nations as we know them. All right, so we have finished the creation period. Someone last week asked me for a timeline. I didn't print one, but if you want to make a timeline, you can get a piece of paper or somewhere and make it. On your timeline, we're gonna start over on the left, and you can put the creation happened before. I'm not going to argue old earth and new earth, but before 4000 BC. That's when the creation happened. So if on your timeline, that's your first thing, before 4000 BC. You can read about that and see different opinions on that. Okay, so now let's look at our map for the creation period. If you will look at your map, here's what you need to do. Circle the dot indicating the possible location of Eden. We talked last week, we don't really know where the Garden of Eden was. It's sort of hidden. But it's there at where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together. They converge there, right in top of the Persian Gulf. Eden's in there somewhere. Okay, so that's the Garden of Eden. So let's turn now to the page 22. This is what you do this week sometime. Do it next Monday night if you want to. Just fill in those blanks. Creation, Adam, Eden. Adam is created by God, but he sins and brings sin into the world. And the reason you're writing it is so you can remember, so that you will have a step-by-step historical timeline of the Old Testament. And then fill in the blanks there. The description, I gave you the description. You just write the event. It's all on the pages before, and it's all in order that we went through. Creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel. You can do that this weekend or next week, whatever. Okay, so do the test the week before the next Bible study. It will take you 45 seconds, if that. Okay, now turn the page to page 23, and we're going to look at the patriarch period. And I did remember to put this scripture in there. You can read about the patriarch period in Genesis 12 through 50. And on your timeline, if you want to write 2000 BC, that's when approximately, this is when this period happened, when Abraham came on the scene. So our period, let's do our creation period out loud together, and then we'll move to the patriarch. So creation, Adam, Eden. Adam is created by God, but he sins and brings sin into the world. Now let's read the patriarch. Patriarch, Abraham, Canaan. Abraham is chosen by God to be the patriarch of many nations and the father of faith. Okay, so in this, our probing deeper, we're going to look at 4 major people in the patriarch period. Abraham, his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob, and his great-grandson Joseph. So Abraham's first. He's the father of the Hebrew people. You can read about that in Genesis 12 through 23. We hear about Abraham all the time, and we hear sermons about him. And now we're going to see where he lived and where he traveled to. So he was the father of the Hebrew people. By this time, thousands of years, the world is full of immoral, corrupt people, but God is still moving toward his plan, and that his plan is the redemption for all of us. In chapter 12, I think that's where we meet Abraham. It's about 2100 BC. God appears and tells him, he said, hey, I want you to pack up your wives and your kids. We didn't have any kids. Your wife, and head out. I want you to go. I've got a promise for you, and this is what he promised him, that his descendants would be more greater than the stars. He'd have a great nation. The land of Canaan would be theirs as their homeland, and all mankind would be blessed by one of his descendants. And of course, as we follow the timeline, we know that that's Jesus came from his descendants. So his descendants would become a great nation. Canaan would be their land, given to them forever, and all mankind would be blessed by one of his descendants. Okay, so Abraham probably laughed because he didn't even have any kids, and he was 100 years old, and his wife was 90 years old, and God told him to pack up everything, your camels and all your stuff and your goods, and go to Canaan. So Abraham was a man of faith. Even though he had no children, how could God bless me and my descendants? I don't even have a baby. I have no sons. But he had faith, so he packed up and he moved to Ur from Canaan, made a few stops along the way. And Sarah, his wife, said, well, God made this promise, so we need a baby. So she gave her maidservant to him, and they had a baby. And God said, no, that's not what I was talking about. But then God opened Sarah's womb as a 90-year-old, and she had Isaac. And then we moved to Isaac, number 2, the second father of the promise. So the promises of Abraham, everything he promised Abraham, got passed down to his son Isaac. And you can read about that in Genesis 24 through 26. So he becomes the second father of the promise. Everything's passed down to him. He got to see a lot of miracles. So God had tested Abraham and said, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. So Abraham agreed, followed God's instruction, went to sacrifice Isaac. You know this story probably. And God supplied an animal in this place, another type of Christ here, Isaac. Jesus is our replacement for our death. But the cool thing about where Isaac, I learned this in studying this, that when he went to sacrifice Isaac, it was on Mount Moriah, and that's where the temple was eventually going to be built, where all the sacrifices were made. So I thought that was cool. So Isaac lived in the land of Abraham. He becomes prosperous, and he dies an old man. But the new nation still had a slow start because he only had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob stole Esau's birthright, and now let's move down to Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, Genesis 27 through 35. If you don't have enough room to take notes, you can take them on the opposite page. Some of these have room, some don't. Okay, so Jacob was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. The promises of Abraham that were passed down to Isaac are now passed down to Jacob. The land, the descendants, bless you with descendants numerous in the stars, and you have this Canaan as your home forever. So Jacob did what he could to have to help this move along. So he had 12 sons. And so he's known as the father of the nation of Israel. And his 12 sons are what's called the 12 tribes of Israel. So we're moving through that timeline from Abraham down to Isaac. Now Jacob, he has 12 sons, and those become the 12 tribes of Israel. And we're going to study those in a little bit. And then the last person is Joseph. He was the favorite son. He was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he was the favorite. Genesis 27 through 50. The rest of Jacob's sons were not very committed to God's plan and God's idea for the Hebrew nation. But God had his hand on Joseph just like he has his hand on you from the beginning of time, and had an incredible story for him. And you can read about that. I think last year, they did a series on Joseph's life here at church, and it was awesome. So Joseph's brothers didn't like him. They mistreated him. Lots of things happened. They sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Egypt. Okay, so now he's out of the promised land. He's out of Canaan, and Joseph's gone to Egypt. A famine happens, and so his brothers think he's dead, but they go to Egypt to find food because it had a wealthy place. So they go to Egypt to find food, and during that time, they found their brother Joseph there, and a wonderful story of reconciliation and forgiveness. Joseph embraces his brothers who were so mean to them, and he takes care of them. So he said, hey, go back home, get all the brothers, get dad, and come here to Egypt. And I remember when it dawned on me, because I know the story of Moses delivering the people out of Egypt. I don't think I ever realized how they got to Egypt. I knew that I never put the timeline together. They were in Egypt because Joseph had gone there, and then he brought his family there because of the famine. So they all moved to Egypt. About 70 people. So there's about 70 people that he packed up and moved to Egypt. Years pass, Joseph dies, everybody dies, nobody remembers Joseph anymore, and they multiply. These people multiply so fast. They keep having children, and the Pharaoh said, hey, there's just way too many people, so let's just put them into slavery. So the Pharaoh put all of Abraham's descendants into slavery. And they were in slavery for 400 years. And just like us, when we go through trials, we pray for deliverance, and that's what the Hebrew people did. They prayed for deliverance, and God delivered them. Okay, so now we are done with the patriarch period. Turn next page. Let's look at the map. So we've looked at creation. It happened in Eden. 2,000 or so years later, depending on when creation was, Abraham appears on the scene. So on your map it says, draw an arrow from Ur, it's right there, where Abraham lived, to Canaan. So he moved to Canaan. And then from Canaan, Abraham and Joseph and his brothers and descendants, they moved to Egypt. This is the whole geographical movement of the patriarch period. From Ur to Canaan to Egypt, where they are enslaved for 400 years. Okay. All right, we're cooking. Okay, the test is on page 25. Fill in those blanks this week and to help you memorize the periods and the person and the place and the portrait. Now turn to page 26. This is the Exodus period. And if you're doing a timeline, this is about 1500 BC. So let's walk through the periods that we've already talked about. The creation, let's say it together. Creation, Adam, Eden. Adam is created by God, but he sins and brings sin into the world. Then we have the patriarch period. You might have to look back. The patriarch, it's Abraham. The place was Canaan. Abraham is chosen by God to be the patriarch of many nations and the father of faith. Okay, now the Exodus. It's Exodus, and our main person is Moses, and it happened in Egypt. And here's our portrait. Through Moses, God delivers the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt and gives them the law. So this is what happens next on our historical march through the Old Testament. They're enslaved in Egypt because of Joseph and his brothers. They lived there for a long time. They all died off. Pharaoh didn't know these people because it was a new Pharaoh. He doesn't even know Joseph, and so he enslaves them, and they're there for 400 years, and they're crying out to God for deliverance. So let's look at the probing deeper. We're going to look at 4 major events that happened during the Exodus period. Y'all are going to be such Bible scholars when you're done with this. Okay, deliverance. Freedom from slavery in Egypt. And you can read about that in Exodus 1 through 18. So do you remember how many people Joseph moved to Egypt with his family? About 70. Well, now there's probably nearly 2 million of Abraham's descendants living in Egypt, and they're all in slavery. And they cried out to God for deliverance, and God raised up Moses, and we know the story of Moses. And he became the spokesperson to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. And he said, you need to let these people go back to their homeland. Pharaoh refused. He goes, no, I need them. I need them in to do all my work for me. There's 2 million. I'm putting them in slavery. They can't go. And so God sent through Moses a lot of plagues. We've heard about the plagues. They were bad plagues, and they got worse and worse and worse and worse until the firstborn son of every household died, and Pharaoh's son. And so he said, okay, I'm going to let them go. So he relented, and he let them go. But then he changed his mind, and he started chasing them. And the Hebrews got to the Red Sea. The Red Sea opened. Moses and his people, the 2 million people, went through the Red Sea, and then God closed the sea, and the Egyptians could not get them, and so they were finally free. They were headed to the promised land, the land that had been promised to Abraham. Whenever I think about this, this is not written down, so I'm telling a story, it's not written down. I have this entrepreneurial spirit in me. I want to do something different. And I've always wanted I love theme parks. I've gone to all of them. My kids take me to Dollywood with their kids because they know I'll ride all those rides because they won't ride them. I'm, doing all those crazy things. I went to Universal Studios for my birthday with a friend. I love rides. So I wanted to open a new Old Testament theme park. Would y'all come? I think I would only need about $15 trillion to do it. But like you go through these periods of the Bible on a ride, like the creation, it's those cool virtual rides, like at Universal Studios where you actually feel like you're Harry Potter flying through the sky on a broomstick, those kind of things. And the creation, but my favorite is, I've already named the ride, it's called the Red Sea Adventure. So you're running through the desert, arrows are coming past you or swords or whatever. You're being pursued and you're on this thing and you're running and chariots are after you, and then you get to the Red Sea and you think you're going to drown and it opens and you virtually go through it and little water drops fall on you, make it more realistic. You see fish jumping around over here, and then you come through and the thing closes and everybody behind you dies. I just think it would be... My other favorite is who's gone to Disney World? It's a Small World ride. It's a small world. That would be the genealogy. So we'd go through all those genealogy books, like, Noah had 3 sons, and they're popping up and dancing. And you learn the genealogy as you ride on a boat. I think it's great. But anyway, I'll let y'all know if it comes. the plagues, the plagues that you look down and your arms are being eaten by locusts. I just think that'd be awesome. All right, I lost my place. Where were we? Okay, so have we talked about deliverance? Yes, we have. So they chased them out, and they're headed to the promised land. And now let's go to number 2, the law. This is the second major event that happened during the Exodus period. And you can read about that in Exodus 19 through 40. Okay, so the law. So Mount Sinai, Moses went to Mount Sinai. They crossed the Red Sea. The first stop is Mount Sinai. They're all there, 2 million people. I don't know how they communicated with each other, but they did. Moses went alone on the mountain. God gave him a tablet of the 10 commandments that God wrote with his own finger, and the commandments of the law, and also how their relationship to God should be. He promised to bless them abundantly, and it's this point is where the nation of Israel takes on a national identity of Israel. So God promises while they're at Mount Sinai to bless them for their obedience and to curse them, curse is not the right word, for their disobedience. Show them justice, I guess. The Hebrew people now began to take on a national identity of Israel. Okay, number 3. So they're just crossed the Red Sea. They got the 10 commandments. They go to this place called Kadesh Barnea. It was an oasis. And this is known as a place of rebellion against God. You can read about it in Numbers 10 through 14. So they go there to this oasis, and it's a gateway to the promised land. I remember when it dawned on me that the promised land, why it's called the promised land, because it was promised to Abraham. I was a kid, and because I thought it was promised land, but it's the promised land, the land that's promised to Abraham and his descendants. So the Kadesh Barnea was on the cusp. They were right outside. They wanted to go in, but they were afraid to. The land where they used to live, that was their land, was filled with Canaanites who were not so nice people. They worshiped idols. They had these crazy sex things they did. They even sacrificed their children to God, to Canaanite gods. We're going to talk more about why they did this later in the conquest period. So they sent some spies into the land, 12 of them. I think it was 12. Was it 12 spies? Yes, 12 spies into the land to check it out. They came back and said, hey, I got good news, I got bad news. The good news is it's a beautiful land. It's flowing with milk and honey. I don't really know what that means, but flowing with milk and honey. But the bad news is there's giants in the land. They sort of lied. There weren't any giants in the land. There were some bad people, but they weren't necessarily giants. So the 10 spies said, we can't conquer this land, which is bizarre because God had already told them this is their land. They didn't trust God. They were fearful, and they had little faith. But 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, I think we can do this. We can do this. We're going to do what God told us to do. We can do this. He will give us the wisdom, the knowledge, the manpower to go in and conquer the land. But the majority sided with the 10 spies, and they did not go in. So that's why Kadesh Barnea is known as a place of rebellion against God. Okay, so that led to 40 years of wandering, Numbers 20 to 36. So there's consequences of their disobedience. So they had to wander around in the wilderness forever. They didn't get to go in. Anyone who was 21 years or older had to die off before they got into the promised land. During this time, God provided the food, the water, the shelter, everything they need, but they were still major whiners. They whined the whole time. So Moses leads them north of the Dead Sea to Jericho, which we'll see on our map. And that's where he encourages them, and you can read about that in Numbers. He encourages them, and he acknowledges what God is going to do with them, but he knows he's not going to see the promised land, and so Moses dies there. You can read about that in Numbers also. So Moses is gone, our fearless leader. Okay, so let's look at our map. We're doing great on time. Okay, let's look at our map. So what we're going to do now, this is the geography of the Exodus period. Draw an arrow from Egypt. Oh, again, remember last week I told you I mislabeled the Nile? Where I have the Red Sea, that's the Nile. The Red Sea is that body of water to the right of that. Somehow I mislabeled that. Forgive me. Draw an arrow from Egypt through the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments and the law. And then they went to Kadesh Barnea. And then they went to the top of the Dead Sea. Remember where the Dead Sea is? On the east side of the Jordan River. And that's where they stayed, and they wandered for 40 years. Do you remember where the Dead Sea is? The corn dog? Okay. So the Exodus test, you may do that this week sometimes on your own. You'll have your creation period, your patriarch period, and your Exodus period. We've learned 3 out of 9. According to my math, we're 30% done with the history of the Old Testament. So fill in that, and then next week we'll work on the conquest period. We're going to have some time at your table to have a little bit of discussion. There's some questions on the table. There maybe like 3 sheets. I just wrote out some questions. Feel free to talk about whatever you want to that's related to Bible study. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to have 30 minutes in our small groups. But before we start, Lindsay, do you want to make your announcement now or after? Okay, Lindsay's got an announcement to make, and then we'll do our small groups.
Hi, if we haven't met, my name is Lindsay Feltman. I'm going to be starting a women's Bible study small group that's going to be talking about practicing the ways of Jesus. And basically, we're going to look at different spiritual practices that mimic the lifestyle that Jesus led. So things like prayer, fasting, solitude. Those are the kinds of things that we'll be studying in depth. We'll spend about a month on each of those. And that's going to start, we're going to meet for the first time at the end of September, Wednesday, the 27th, I believe. So it's 7:30 to 9. That's because I'm a young mom, and I want to get my child to bed first, and so then we can study the Bible after. I know it's a little bit late, but please join us if you have any interest in learning how to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus and practice his ways in your own life. Thank you. It's not going to be here. It's actually going to be in a home. And if you sign up, I've got a sign-up sheet somewhere. And I'll meet you at the back table after we finish here. If you want to sign up, give me your information, and we'll make sure that you've got all the information you need to join. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.